We're just negotiating how we're going to ask the questions. I'll begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, most particularly the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people on whose land we're meeting. I pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. But I also note, my friends, that in the history of this continent, land was never ceded by any Aboriginal person. I acknowledge the Chief Executive Officer of TEXA, Anthony McLaren, and the great organising committee for the work that they do as our regulator. I also acknowledge particularly Dr. Lynn Martin, who is retiring in the not too distant future, and to whom most of us in this room owe much to quality assurance and the need for indicators and measures to ensure that inclusion, diversity, and the quality of what we do goes well. It began and I just note it all started, of course, with a Fair Chance for All, that great document that set Australia on the map as one of the great thinkers about higher education, and it went into the Bradley reforms and all the things that we're talking to now. And so, Lynn, thank you so much for being here. It's always unnerving talking in front of Lynn. There'll be many questions to me afterwards, but I'm looking forward to those. My Deakin colleagues, I'm recently retired. Lovely to see you all here. Keep up the hard work. And I'll finally say, I declare a conflict about regulation. I'm a director of UniSuper. With almost everyone in the room, I think, is a member of UniSuper. But I too have an intense interest in our APRA partnership and its impact on our collective retirement savings. Be sure I work in your best interests and, of course, my own. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk this afternoon. I was actually going to give you quite a long paragraph now on all the regulation you have and why it's the issue it is. I thought the previous session was excellent. I particularly note the points from the TAFE vocational education side. And so I'm going to cut to the chase on a few other things which I thought I wouldn't say, which I now will say. And so I think I'll start by saying that when I started working in universities as a lab demonstrator at WITS in South Africa in the dark ages of the 70s of apartheid, I remember we were not permitted to speak to the head of our department, God Professor Boris Belinsky in my case. I recall being genuinely terrified of him. It was probably fair to say at that time that the building blocks of universities, our traditions, governance, models, instructional design, had changed little since the first universities of the Middle Ages. We had slow incremental change, I think, in the way education was delivered, supported and accessed. We discussed how examinations should be. However, women were of little or no consequence. Students and junior staff were never considered as far as I recall, and diversity and inclusion in those days were words still to be invented. But today, here we are, 45 years later, mostly everything about who and what and where we are is different. Universities, TAFEs no longer have a monopoly on creating, sharing knowledge. The internet is now the primary platform for information exchange. And by way of example, my 95-year-old mother, why use a young person when you can use an older one? My 95-year-old mother, whose formal education ended when she left school, is proficient on her iPad and uses it for learning. She now can read fluent Spanish. Why? Well, because she could. Her entertainment, she's an authority on The Crown. Anytime you want to know anything, my mother can tell you where they got it wrong. And for communication, most especially with her children and her grandchildren, the internet and global connectivity opened her world and keep her young, interested and connected. Likewise, I think global connectivity, internet analytics, and the new media has reshaped everything in the global higher education sector, including how universities are viewed, valued, and trusted. And it's to those relationships I want to spend a moment. This has meant that the sector has had to adjust very quickly to being transparent. I know we have to be more transparent about selection, about diversity, quality assurance, particularly about failure rates, about cheating, and of course, about graduate employment outcomes, regulation. Our research topics are now often subject to derision and interference in funding decisions by those who have power, and the discomforting reality that opinion often counts much more than facts and evidence. Some days we face accusations of being out of touch and self-serving, disinterested in our students. Alongside this, the division between Australian universities and Australian vocational education sector has been viewed as oppositional rather than in partnership. But I think most hurtful of all, in this post-truth world, expertise and evidence are frequently disregarded. Alternative facts and fake news now compete on an equal footing with peer-reviewed journals and authoritative sources. As the late Stephen Hawking said last year, just before his death, and I quote, "We are witnessing the global revolt against experts." I thought George Megalogenesis touched on that and the previous session to an extent, starting to think about who we are against the plethora, the myriad of regulation which we must abide by as citizens of Australia, as members of this great community, and of course as publicly funded all of institutions. And everything around us is understandable as we watch the impact of Industry 4.0, wreaking havoc with jobs, with supply chains, and particularly, importantly, with wages of workers. Consequently, our democracy is having a difficult moment. Our democracies are having a difficult moment, exacerbated by the great moral challenges of climate change, the impact of violence, and most significant, the movement of displaced people across our world. Education systems globally are not immune, and the issues are front and centre to our purpose. The International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde said it like this, very aptly I thought, just recently, and she says, all countries need to reinvent their education systems for the digital age, and this is not just adding a few coding lessons. It is about fostering the critical thinking, independent problem solving, and the lifelong learning that can help people adjust to change. It is, she said, about investing in human capital. And so the topic of this conference, I think, is a good one, partnerships, and I'm going to talk a bit about what my experience has been of leading and managing partnerships as a Chief Executive Officer, but also as a Vice-Chancellor of a university. I'll say less about the aspects of regulation because I think you heard a very good summary just a few minutes ago, and after this you will have the standards panel and you'll hear from some experts again. So I'm going to talk about the practical experience, I think. Geelong will be the example, and I'll add some comments about our regulator in our current environment. I'm going to particularly note Professor Beverly Oliver, Professor Emerita here, who was central to some of the work that was done, much of all of the work on teaching and learning, but I will come to that in a minute. But going back to 2010, Geelong, I arrived in a town from Western Australia. Western Australia was in a resources boom. There were not enough people. The computer science class at Curtin had gone from something like 17 people doing honours to 1 because everyone had gone to the Pilbara to work and earn $100,000 a year and decided not to finish their degrees. But here in Geelong, there was a drought and everyone was leaving, literally. Ford, Alcoa, Shell, and pretty much everyone else was upping sticks. There were massive job losses and most people walked away. There was palpable despair everywhere. Manufacturing appeared to be dead. They were doomed, they said. We needed to do something. To my chagrin, I recall early on in that time a crisis meeting of civic leaders to which the university was not invited, as we were not seen as part of a solution of how a town could survive. The most shocking wake-up call for us as educators and as citizens, and goes to the heart of what I want to say about partnership. We got to partnership because of a crisis. There is no time here to go through the decisions that Deakin University took to double down on all of its efforts in Geelong, its originating headquarters. Suffice to say, there was collective agreement that the 1,000-year-old tradition of universities meant that we could not walk away from our responsibilities in the town, despite some consultants telling us we should just up sticks and go to Melbourne because we do so much better there. We decided to bet the house on Geelong and to help rebuild a town, or at least try to see if a town, a regional town, could survive. To create a university town became the idea, a big risk. Our council was watchful, not particularly persuaded. The first step was, of course, to reach out to this town that didn't invite us to the meetings and ask what they needed us to do. Those early conversations, mostly listening, were the bedrock of the partnership that exists today. As it turned out, surprisingly, they simply wanted jobs for their citizens. The university, on the other hand, was desperately worried and needed students to educate and, of course, good staff to teach and do research. And hence, after a stormy, cool, hot-headed courtship, a perfect marriage emerged, in my view. A partnership today that is mutually beneficial, multi-stranded, but above all, respectful. All major activities in Geelong now include the university by definition. The town, which is no longer on its knees, is a robust place. People are hopeful and they're proud. And all we really need now in Geelong is another AFL premiership title. On the serious side, citizens say that Deakin saved Geelong. I say a community in partnership with the university gave Geelong its future by facing the challenges of massive change and managing the risks of a depressed community. And so my first retrospective learning about partnerships in an education setting in a town is that the essential ingredient of any partnership is to bring your strengths to the table, leave your ego at the door, to be humble, to talk little, to listen lots, and to show up and be visible, to be present, particularly at the senior levels of the organisation. The second learning, I think, and we learned this well, is you must set understandable outcomes in language that people understand and adhere to timeframes that are at least within the sensibility of a community. Saying it will take 10 years to do something is never going to cut it in a community that is in strife. And of course, I know we can get operationalised and transactional. There must be measurable outcomes that can be understood by the very community you're working with. No easy task, but I think it is possible and you need to pay attention to make it so. The first significant partnership that is an example in this relationship was based on pure job creation in a new industry backed by the town, the state and the federal government. Geelong is a bellwether seat. Everybody gets interested when things go wrong in Geelong. Carbon fibre was the idea. Carbon fibre was a singular risk for the university and the country in 2011, as there was no industry. There was no commercial presence in Australia. It was all in China or in America. But we did our homework. We had clever staff who saw opportunity. And of course, luck mostly favours the brave. So that 8 years later, going back to the data I had before I left, many, many hundreds of jobs were created in and around manufacturing, and particularly on the Warm Ponds campus, related to carbon fibre, to lightweighting, to looking at renewables as part of the energy issues and drivers around how you would work in a different world. It went well. Everyone noticed and everybody perked up. Council relaxed, quite a few wins there. Staff relaxed as jobs became more secure as we started to grow. A key observation, however, for me, was that part of that success was the observation that we, the university, used our own money and invested in significant innovation in the startups on our campus. Not huge amounts, but enough money for people to notice. That action, noticed by the community, gave them confidence. As someone said to me, well, you're not going to spend money if you're leaving or collapsing. One of the startups, Carbon Revolution, a poster child. If you don't know of it, you're not with us. Carbon Revolution makes carbon fibre wheels to an export market against a very high dollar. It now employs well over 200 people in their factory on the campus. In 2020, it's about to go public offer. The AFR gave it a fantastic write-up the other day. The significant return to the university of the investment it made to help a town get a few jobs will give us a return and will be a small measure of the success of that partnership. There will be probably a financial gain. The big measure will be the trust and the confidence, the friendship and the joy of working with ordinary people in the community who have simple ideas about their future. That's the real measure of the town. From this risky idea, a new industry has begun to grow in Australia, in a regional town, in Geelong, and who would have thunk it? Today, the campus has a brand new hospital on its doorstep. The Geelong Symphony is established. The world-ranked Cadell Evans women's and men's cycle road races, both at the highest level, are outcomes and products of this one partnership, the university and the town, but of course, it's a community. A different partnership, the relationship with the Geelong Football Club, which is deep and all-encompassing on youth participation, culture and health, is a similar one. A great learning was that working with the sports industry is no different to working with the manufacturing industry, except you have to experience the highs and lows every Saturday or Sunday. They both have the same issues: strategy, money, customers, HR. What does the future look like? At its most basic, I think university-industry partnerships, which is our future, industry, business, I mean it in the sense of everyone who is not us, not-for-profits, is relatively simple. But relationships need nurturing, marriages need nurturing, we all know this. Partnerships with business and the wider community, however, take time. They need process. Above all, they need staff whose primary job is to make them work. And the staff allocated to these roles must be predisposed emotionally and intellectually to working with and in community and understand their needs and their problems and never talk of our needs and our problems. I believe that was our game changer. Initially, subject matter experts looked after partners. And of course, discipline leaders, the discipline experts must be involved. But on the day-to-day, the grinding issues of the day-to-day and the longer-term development of deep relationship and shared strategy, improvement in quality and delivery of outcomes, and from our perspectives, those must include education and new ideas and new research, must be someone's to be responsible for and not something that is done between jobs. So that was industry and business, and I thought I'd say something. I've said nothing about the regulator at this point. I now want to turn to another example of partnership. Internal partnerships with staff and students to change the university. In 2010, the other issue the university faced was the sudden threat of the spectacular rise of the smartphone and the associated big data presented to the distance education model for which Deakin was famous. 2007, Steve Jobs held up the phone. We all knew we wanted one. By 2010, we knew the implications of the smartphone. The threat seemed existential because in the blink of an eye, a highly successful business based on hard copy study guides and phone calls was pretty much over. Our problem was most of our students did not want paper guides anymore. Our real problem was staff loved them. The university faced a bleak future: reform an existing business or die. And so, in fact, the biggest and the riskiest change Deakin has ever undertaken was a partnership to re-engage with staff and students with an aspiration to go digital. The move to a digital strategy in 2010-2011 was seen by many as foolhardy, and I got lots of advice. I recall a new staff member saying that we were all on drugs. If only we were. And we were definitely doomed over this. We decided in 2010 that the smartphone was where we had to be, mobile and cool, And I mean cool in the contemporary sense of being in the moment and able to meet the needs of the moment. To be the premier university at the digital frontier was the ambition, even though we were not at all sure where that digital frontier was and what it looked like. But we knew, because of our history of distance education, it was going to hurt if we did not go there. Two big changes, easily measurable, were decided upon. And here I do note Professor Emerita Beverly Oliver for her genius in helping us with our teaching and learning. These two measures changed Deakin. The first one we decided was on a system that provided students with 3 points of admission, of examination and graduation annually. The so-called trimester system, revolutionary and industrially very unpopular at the beginning. If you ever want to read about me, it always comes up on trimester. Alongside this idea to make it easy for our students who normally didn't come to have a relationship with us, was to be able to do it more frequently. Alongside this, we reimagined our curriculum to be based on assessed evidence of the Deakin graduate learning outcomes, the GLOWs as they became known. These two revolutions in traditional practice were the basis of a strategic plan to survive and thrive in a university whose heritage, whose past was as a distance educator in a regional town. It was a partnership strategy from the beginning. There were 4 major partnerships, I think, which helped achieve the outcome. And of course, we did this in the framework of the massive change that was beginning to consume us. A university that is, and the aim was to be a university that is digitally and culturally enabled. The partnership with staff and the academic board, my friends, and this is where we get to using your own regulation to your own benefit, meant getting very honest about things like money and load and reputation. The academic board for the first time saw the balance sheet of the university. They were horrified because, of course, academic board didn't need to see the money because it wasn't their responsibility. But of course it was, because they were members of the university. We enabled people to have their say once they knew about the money, the load, and our reputation. Letting staff, over 2,000 of them, get involved in new ideas was intense. Communication was endless, detailed, and valuable, as you know. No self-respecting university person, academic, professional, or otherwise, can say anything in a paragraph when 5 pages will do. And when I began, I think that we thought we'd never get there. We did. And today, my hope is the legacy of regular updates on the good, the bad, and the ugly every quarter by the Vice-Chancellor with the Executive President is the way to go forward and keep everything open and honest. No secrets, no surprises. The partnerships with students are true north, became the byline, meant that they had representation at every part of our system, in their disciplines, at faculty, at council, with the VC. Revolutionary in 2011, where I was. The Live the Future strategic plan became unapologetically student-centric. If we were going to go digital, our education had to be about the individual, and that individual were our students. They weren't customers, they were our students. And we got the trust, I think, because over a period of time, year after year, we did what we said we would do. We put the students at the centre. We looked at their education from the perspective of the outcomes they needed and worked backwards. Their experience was our key measure of culture and success. The outcome of the 2 primary initiatives, augmented by, of course, many projects, has been that students and staff went mobile at Deakin very early in the decade. By the beginning of 2012, iPads, phones were what we used for everything. We never used to tell people to switch off their phones. We used to tell them to make them silent, but to keep looking at their phones. Today, everything is run from a digital-first perspective. Costs are controlled, expectations are met, and satisfaction and enjoyment is higher than it's ever been. The regulator's role in change matters, in my view, and here is where I want to talk about the power and the use of a regulator. Moving to the trimester took some explaining to AUQUA. I don't know, I'm sure there's many people in the room who have no idea what AUQUA is. Many of you do. The Australian Universities Quality Agency came to Deakin. They were forensic in their examination of our trimester. They gave us lots of advice, but in the end, because of the detail from our academic board of how we had done what we'd done against our own regulations and against everything else, they said yes. And then there was TEXA. Credentials were the issue at that time, and I think Beverly yesterday talked a bit about micro-credentials and how we got there. We moved early into professional practice degrees and different forms of evidence-based assessment. Because there were issues with the Australian qualifications framework, we couldn't see where a credential would fit, we agonised. And Beverly actually said, well, why don't we go and talk to TEXA? I just about had a heart attack, but we did. And I attended the first meeting. It was a very interesting meeting as we took a problem to our regulator and say, what do you think? It meant, however, we had an incredibly helpful discussion. Detail was shared openly. It also meant that a few years later, our reaccreditation process was due. And unfortunately, TEXA already knew everything about what Deakin was doing with professional practice and credentials, and we got a clean report. Partnership and trust with the regulator matter. There are no deals. TEXA doesn't do deals. TEXA doesn't cut corners, but they do enable quality assurance if you're prepared to have the discussion, the arguments, and the evidence. But it was all hard. I remember sleepless nights, and I acknowledge the work of many, many staff who worked on change within a regulation framework, which was the university. I particularly note one outcome of everything we did was that as money tightens, staff workloads do become a problem. And in this new era in which we live, re-looking at how university staff work and who does what and how and when and how they are remunerated is something you need to do. If staff are not with you, everything is harder. And it won't matter what regulation you have because nothing will work. I was going to say a bit about the great outcomes. Those magnificent changes we did as partnership deals allowed us to go up the rankings. We won many prizes. Our quilt and our CEQ results improved. Staff have stood taller as their work and their efforts were the reason we did so well. Students stood taller and told us that their test aimers were worth more than when they started. And so I've got just a couple of ideas. Do you want me to finish up? You're standing there. If I had to say, what would I do now as part of the regulation collectively? I would say you need to look at Curriculum 5.0 as a sector. Social and demographic change means that we need real-time curriculum, relevant, measured in terms of skill development, not content, easily accessible. But I do pose the question, why, in a sector that's pressed for money, we still have 40 customised learning management systems to deliver learning across the disciplines we all teach, and why we have over 40 customised student databases to keep exactly the same information about every person in every institution because of our regulation. I think surely less is more, and collaboration through partnership in our sectors would be beneficial and free up money for other things which are important. And the other thing I would say, the world of work and success in the machine age will be important. We do need to think about the growth of AI and what it will mean in our communities and the kind of jobs that people will have, because most people, most governments, most communities have three things they worry about. You know what they are: jobs, jobs and jobs. And in the age of machines, the uncertainty that has brought the consequences of anxiety into our democracy come back to some of those great revolutions that have enabled us to do the things that we do. Ethics and integrity, understanding the consequence of decisions about data and usage in the world of work will probably get worse. And I think we need to think about that in terms of machines and how work works. I wanted to say just one last thing, and that was about blockchain. In our increasingly data-saturated environment, privacy and security issues will stay front of mind. And I think it's important to be transparent and secure. And you need to put maximum control in the hands of those who use our services, ensuring privacy. But I think blockchain has potential for us as a sector, and I include the whole sector now, the tertiary sector, vocational, as an authenticity check on cheating to record credentials and other data, such as assessment and learning achievements. I see it possibly as the next big disruptor after MOOCs, and you'll note I haven't mentioned MOOCs because that was so yesterday. My fourth point is about structure and governance, and what can I say? We do need to get this right. We still use an ecclesiastical calendar. We still do things. The role of teachers is to impart knowledge. The role of students is to be assessed. Really, we've moved on. Administrative structures are the same. We still use 20th century administrative structures. Surely it's time to look at how we take down the silos and we go the other way. And I do commend Mary Stewart's work, the Permeable University. It started off as a civic university. William, you mentioned it. After retirement, I went and spent some time up with Mary, and we had long discussions about the role of how do you make the university civic, a partnership in its community. And then finally, the one big topic, internationalization and Australia's place in the world. We do live in the most interesting region of the world. Our biggest competitor was once our biggest market. China, the biggest trading partner. I was talking to someone just recently who said, an expert said that the relationship between Australia and China was now worse than it was at the time of the Tiananmen Square disaster. How can it be, and how can we get a relationship with our greatest market, our greatest competitor, our largest trading partner, and of course one of the most populous places on the planet? How Australian universities operate in this scenario, and what we should do in our region as leaders, particularly in relation to integrity and quality assurance, will matter. We need to be on the right side of history. How do we remain educators and focused on an engaged contemporary student experience for all our students, irrespective of origin, culture, religion, and nationality? So I'll end then by just saying that on the eve of the next decade, it is the case that big government and the even bigger moral issue of our times may well take their toll on all of us. Our regulation needs to be able to accommodate our capacity to deal with some of this. Climate change, people displacement, refugees. The right to speak out and to be heard without fear or favour is an issue where universities in partnership with their staff must lead the unswerving desire for truth through research and evidence. The task is huge and the risk is great, but the greater risk of doing nothing and simply hoping for the best, that the regulation will go away, that we'll all go back to the future, will be a betrayal of our originating values of a 1,000-year-old tradition from which we have all benefited and hold so dear. Thank you for listening, and good fortune to you all.